We are currently installing multi-million-dollar AI systems into nuclear power plants, commercial airliners, and trauma centers based on a fundamentally flawed premise. I mean, we are basically just guessing.
Yeah.
We are crossing our fingers and hoping that injecting these really complex algorithms into life-or-death environments actually helps the people running them.
It is, it's an incredibly uncomfortable reality to confront.
Okay.
Because we look at the sheer sophistication of modern algorithms, right? The processing power, the predictive models, and we naturally just assume that the strategy for integrating them into human workflows is equally sophisticated.
Right. Which it isn't.
It isn't at all.
Yeah.
The bedrock assumption of the tech industry for, well, the last decade has been a dangerous oversimplification.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are looking at this paradigm-shifting academic paper alongside a really striking infographic that details something called the neurovalidation layer.
Yes, that infographic is fascinating.
It really is. And these sources, they outline a massive shift in high-stakes technology. We're talking about using neuroscience, specifically a field called neuroergonomics, to identify exactly where and when AI is biologically required by the human brain.
Exactly. Not where a software engineer thinks it might be useful, but where the organic hardware of the human mind literally demands it.
And this requires a complete inversion of how we design systems, right? We are moving away from asking what the technology is capable of and finally asking what the human nervous system can actually tolerate.
Right. And for you listening, whether you are, managing a complex tech stack at your company, directing a team, or just trying to navigate the flood of smart software in your daily life, understanding how your brain structurally processes AI assistance is going to completely alter how you view the tools you use.
Absolutely. So let's unpack the current state of affairs, because it is totally wild to me that for all the billions poured into artificial intelligence, we have essentially been flying blind.
The bleely play.
The prevailing theory in what the sources call the AI everywhere era is basically just more AI equals less human workload.
That is the equation driving almost all current development in safety-critical domains right now.
Yeah.
Aviation, maritime operations, emergency response. I mean, the floodgates are just completely open.
Yep.
The assumption is that if a machine takes over a portion of a task, the human operator is automatically relieved of that corresponding cognitive burden.
Which, if we're being honest, sounds perfectly logical.
It does on the surface.
Right, like if I have to carry 10 boxes and you build a robot to carry 5 of them, my physical workload is cut in half. So why wouldn't we assume the brain works the exact same way?
Because cognitive load just doesn't operate by the same physical laws as mechanical load. And that assumption leads directly into what the sources identify as the technology-driven trap.
The technology-driven trap. Okay, break that down for us.
So engineers are fundamentally problem solvers, right? They look at a workflow, let's say an air traffic controller managing a holding pattern, and they see a task that is mathematically complex and historically prone to human error.
Sure.
So they build an AI to automate it, not because they actually measured a deficit in the controller's cognitive capacity, but simply because the technological capability to automate it exists.
I see. So they are building the solution before they've accurately diagnosed the disease.
Exactly. The design process originates with the silicon, not the synapse. And this exposes really the most glaring vulnerability in how we deploy these systems.
Which is?
Our current methods for measuring whether AI is actually needed or if it's even working are entirely subjective.
Oh man, this part of the paper just blew my mind. When you contrast the advanced nature of AI with how we actually evaluate its impact on the human, it's almost comical.
It really is.
We are talking about post-task interviews, questionnaires, like literally a researcher with a clipboard doing behavioral observation.
Right. Let's examine why those methods fail structurally, especially when we're talking about high-stakes environments. First of all, they are indirect. You aren't measuring cognitive load, you are measuring someone's opinion of their cognitive load.
Which can be completely skewed.
Oh, completely. Second, they are post hoc. They happen after the crisis has passed. And third, they completely miss the real-time, second-by-second physiological state of the operator.
Okay, wait. I want to push back on the post-hoc issue for a second. Obviously, you can't interview a surgeon while they're clamping an artery.
No, of course not.
You have to ask them afterward. So why is that such a fatal flaw in the data? I mean, memory might fade a bit, but they still know if the task was hard, right?
Well, it's not just fading memory. It is active psychological distortion. When you ask an operator after a grueling, high-stress scenario, say, an unexpected complication during a flight to rate their workload, You are forcing them to filter that experience through hindsight bias, residual adrenaline, and, frankly, their own ego.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the ego aspect.
Yeah. So they might check a box on a NASA TLX questionnaire saying their workload was a 7 out of 10. But biologically, at the absolute peak of the crisis, their brain might have been redlining at 99% capacity.
Yeah.
They could have been mere milliseconds away from catastrophic cognitive failure.
So the survey says they were fine, but the biological reality is they were literally on the cliff edge.
Exactly. And the inverse is equally problematic. They might complain bitterly about a task in a post-interview. They might request an AI upgrade because a procedure is tedious or frustrating.
Right.
But from a neurological standpoint, they actually have an abundance of cognitive bandwidth available.
Yeah.
Frustration just does not equal cognitive overload.
Okay, I see the logic there. We are installing multi-million-dollar systems based on the equivalent of a customer satisfaction survey.
That's exactly what it is.
It's like an airline buying a fleet of massive cargo planes because the passengers feel like they have a lot of luggage without the airline ever actually putting the bags on a scale.
That is a great way to put it.
You are either buying capacity you absolutely don't need, or you're missing the heavy cargo that's actually going to bring the plane down.
That analogy captures the economic and operational waste perfectly.
Uh-huh.
Relying on subjective feelings inevitably leads to AI systems being deployed without any objective evidence that the human brain requires them.
Which is a terrifying reality when that system is, managing a nuclear reactor or a naval destroyer. So if we acknowledge that human intuition and post-task surveys are basically corrupt data sources, the mandate becomes obvious, right? We need to measure what the brain is actually doing in the moment.
Right.
But how do we do that without putting an operator inside a giant hospital machine? This leads us directly into the core of the academic paper and a field called neuroergonomics.
Yes. So neuroergonomics is a synthesis of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and human factors engineering.
Okay.
The defining premise is that human errors, the kind that lead to industrial disasters or aviation accidents, they don't just occur in a vacuum. They are the direct result of hard biological limits being breached.
So we aren't talking about a lack of training or a lack of motivation. We are talking about the hardware of the brain hitting a physical wall.
Yes, exactly. The brain has finite metabolic resources. We have structural limits regarding how much active attention we can sustain, the volume of working memory we can hold, and the speed at which we can execute decision-making.
So training can only do so much.
Right. You can train an operator for a decade, but you cannot train them to bypass the biological constraints of their own neural pathways.
So to measure those constraints, the paper highlights a very specific piece of technology, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or fNIRS.
Yes, fNIRS.
Now, I understand that fMRI machines, the giant magnetic tubes in hospitals, they measure brain activity. How is fNIRS fundamentally different, and why is it the cornerstone of this new AI validation approach?
Well, the mechanics of fNIRS are brilliantly elegant compared to an fMRI. An fMRI relies on massive, supercooled magnets to detect changes in blood flow, which is why it requires a giant claustrophobic tube.
Yeah.
fNIRS, on the other hand, utilizes light. It is a completely non-invasive, highly portable neuroimaging technology. It essentially projects near-infrared light directly through the scalp and the skull, penetrating into the outer cortical layers of the brain.
Wait, let me stop you there. We are literally shining lasers into people's heads to see how hard they are thinking.
Essentially, yes.
How does light tell us anything about cognitive load?
It all comes down to cellular metabolism. When a specific region of your brain is working hard, say you are calculating a complex math problem or trying to diagnose a system failure, the neurons in that region fire rapidly.
Okay, makes sense.
To sustain that firing, they demand more energy, which means the body immediately rushes oxygen-rich blood to that specific localized area.
Ah, the hemodynamic response.
Exactly. Now here is where the near-infrared light comes in. Oxygenated hemoglobin and deoxygenated hemoglobin absorb near-infrared light differently.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So by projecting this light into the brain and measuring exactly how the photons are absorbed and scattered before they bounce back to the sensors, the fNIRS system can calculate, in real time, the exact ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood in a specific region.
Wow.
It's a direct, continuous proxy for neural activation.
And the sources emphasize that they aren't just scanning the whole brain randomly, right? They are highly targeted. They are aiming these sensors specifically at the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
Yes.
Why that specific real estate?
Because the prefrontal cortex is the brain's executive command center. If we are evaluating how someone handles complex work, the motor cortex or the visual cortex only tells a fraction of the story.
Because they're just handling sight and movement. Yeah.
Exactly. The PFC is responsible for executive functions. Active attention, complex planning, working memory, cognitive control. It is the area that synthesizes multiple streams of contradictory information, inhibits impulsive reactions, and formulates a strategic response.
So, if a pilot is flying in clear skies just scanning the horizon, the visual cortex is active, but the PFC might be relatively quiet.
Right.
But the second an engine fire alarm triggers, and they have to prioritize 50 different variables, the PFC demands a massive influx of blood.
Precisely. The PFC acts as the central processing unit managing the crisis. And when that region approaches metabolic saturation, when the blood flow hits a peak and sustains it, we have an objective physiological signal that the operator's cognitive bandwidth is maxed out.
I see the value in the data, but I had a major logistical question here.
Sure.
If we want to replace subjective guessing with this hard data, we need to measure operators doing their actual jobs, right? You can't put an emergency responder in a sterile lab chair and expect realistic stress level.
No, you have to be in the field or a high-fidelity simulator.
But if fNIRS is just a cap with sensors, what happens when the operator moves? If I'm a Navy commander and I jerk my head to yell an order, doesn't that spike my blood pressure or shift the sensors and completely corrupt the light scattering data?
That is a critical point, and it's actually why fNIRS is a game changer compared to older tech. But it requires rigorous methodology. The paper details the use of standard pre-processing to filter out motion artifacts.
Break that down. How do you separate the blood flow of a panicked head jerk from the blood flow of complex problem solving?
It involves advanced signal processing algorithms. Researchers don't just look at the raw light absorption data. They use accelerometers integrated into the fNIRS headset to track the exact physical movement of the head in three-dimensional space.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah. The software then applies mathematical filters like wavelet transforms or principal component analysis to identify spikes in the optical signal that perfectly correlate with the physical movement recorded by the accelerometer.
So if the sensor detects a massive spike in blood flow, but the accelerometer shows the person just sneezed or whipped their head around, the algorithm subtracts that specific noise from the data.
Exactly. It cleans the signal so that what remains is purely the hemodynamic response driven by cognitive effort, not physical exertion or sensor shifting.
That's incredible.
And because fNIRS is highly tolerant to movement once this pre-processing is applied, it means operators can wear it in high-fidelity simulators. They can be moving around, communicating with their team, and interacting with their consoles naturally.
So to put this in perspective, instead of waiting for a mission to end and asking a pilot, hey, were you overwhelmed when the radar jammed, we are essentially strapping a real-time RAM monitor to their forehead.
That is a great way to think about it.
We can watch their cognitive CPU usage spike to 99% at the exact millisecond the radar screen goes blank.
We are mapping the invisible friction of human-machine interaction.
Which is just incredible. But, data without interpretation is just noise.
Sure.
If I have this headset on a team of operators and I'm watching their PFC blood flow fluctuate, what exactly am I looking for? A spike in brain activity doesn't automatically mean we should buy $1 million AI, does it?
No, it doesn't. And this is where the neuroergonomic approach introduces a brilliant theoretical framework. The researchers aren't just looking for hard work.
Right.
They are looking for structural failure points. They identify 3 specific indicators, what the sources term strategic AI triggers.
I want to spend significant time on these because this really feels like the blueprint for the next generation of software engineering. So let's look at trigger number 1. High expert load.
Okay, to understand why this trigger is so critical, we have to look at the neuroscience of neuroplasticity and how expertise physically alters the brain over time.
Okay.
When a novice learns a complex task, let's use the example of an air traffic controller learning a new routing protocol, the task is novel. It requires massive, deliberate cognitive effort. The prefrontal cortex is highly engaged, building new neural pathways.
It's biologically expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah.
But as that controller gains years of experience, a neurological shift occurs. The processing of that routine protocol actually moves away from the deliberate, energy-heavy prefrontal cortex.
Where does it go?
The pathways become insulated with myelin, and the execution of the task relies more on procedural memory circuits, often involving the basal ganglia.
Ah, like muscle memory, but for complex mental tasks.
Exactly.
The brain optimizes the route so it doesn't have to spend PFC energy on it anymore.
Precisely. So from an fNIRS perspective, An expert's prefrontal cortex should show a relatively calm hemodynamic response during standard operational procedures. They have the neural efficiency to handle the baseline workload effortlessly.
So following that logic, the trigger happens when we put an fNIRS sensor on a highly trained 10-year veteran, and we see their prefrontal cortex suddenly spike into the red zone during a specific phase of a task.
Yes. If an expert, someone who has optimized their neural pathways for this exact job, is experiencing maximum cognitive saturation, that is a massive red flag.
Right.
It proves that the difficulty of the task isn't due to a lack of training or familiarity.
Yep.
It indicates a structural limitation in human cognitive capacity itself.
Let me make sure I grasp the implication of that. If the expert's brain hits the wall, it means the system design is fundamentally flawed for human use. You could train them for another 20 years and it wouldn't matter because the human brain simply cannot hold, say, 60 rapidly evolving flight trajectories in working memory simultaneously.
It's a biological hard stop. And that makes this exact moment a prime objective candidate for AI intervention. The data dictates that we bring in AI to handle those specific background calculations explicitly because it exceeds peak human neural capacity.
That is a phenomenal way to isolate the problem. Moving on to trigger number 2, joint team load. This one is fascinating because we are scaling up from an individual's brain to a network of brains.
Right. In domains like emergency response, surgical theaters, or military command centers, success rarely hinges on a single isolated operator. It is entirely dependent on coordinated teamwork, rapid information exchange, and joint problem solving.
And to measure this, the sources say researchers utilize a technique called hyperscanning.
Yes, hyperscanning.
So that's measuring multiple operators' brains simultaneously. I assume they sync the fNIRS data streams to the exact same timeline, but what are they looking for in that combined data?
They're looking for synchronicity, but specifically maladaptive synchronicity. They analyze the data for moments when multiple team members experience elevated cognitive workload in their respective prefrontal cortices at the exact same time.
Why is that simultaneous spike the trigger rather than just one person struggling?
If only one operator's PFC spikes, it might just be a localized issue. Perhaps their specific console malfunctioned or they're dealing with a localized subtask.
Right, that makes sense.
But if the entire team's brain activity spikes simultaneously, it reveals a system-level complexity. It demonstrates a coordination bottleneck that exceeds the collective integrated capacity of the team.
Let's contextualize that. Imagine a Navy command center during a simulated missile threat.
Okay.
The radar operator is maxed out tracking the incoming targets. The communications officer is maxed out trying to relay warnings. The commander is maxed out trying to integrate that information to make a firing decision. The act of communicating the crisis is actually causing a traffic jam in the collective cognitive network.
That is precisely what hyperscanning reveals. The simultaneous spike indicates that the sheer volume of data exchange required to manage the crisis is causing the human network to fail.
Wow.
And that is your AI trigger. You deploy an AI system specifically designed to unclog that communication bottleneck. Perhaps an AI that automatically fuses the radar and communication data into a single, prioritized visual interface for the commander.
So you aren't replacing the team, you are using AI to repair the bandwidth of the team.
Exactly.
Okay, the final trigger. Trigger number 3, recurring activation patterns. This one feels a bit more subtle than a massive system-crashing cognitive spike.
It is subtle, but it's incredibly insidious over long durations. Sometimes a poorly designed interface or a complex procedure doesn't cause a massive spike in cognitive load. Instead, it causes persistent, repeated mental friction.
The analogy that comes to mind is mental compound interest, but in a negative way.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
It's a tiny 1% cognitive tax every single time an operator has to perform a specific microtask. And over a 10-hour shift, that tax bankrupts their energy reserves.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Using fNIRS, researchers look for repeated neural activation patterns in the PFC across different phases of an operation, or whenever a specific interface element is engaged.
What do those patterns mean?
These recurring patterns are consistently associated with task complexity, ambiguity, or the need for constant conflict resolution.
Give me a tangible example of what that hidden friction looks like in a real-world system.
Imagine a maritime operator monitoring a propulsion system. There is a specific gauge that displays a combined metric of temperature and pressure.
Okay.
Because it's a combined metric, every time the operator glances at it, Their prefrontal cortex spikes for just 2 seconds while they mentally decouple the numbers and calculate if the pressure is actually safe relative to the temperature. It doesn't crash their brain in the moment.
But they check that gauge 300 times a shift.
Exactly. Those recurring microspikes in the PFC indicate unnecessary cognitive strain. Once engineers identify that recurring pattern in the fNIRS data, they have isolated the exact coordinate for an AI intervention.
So what does the AI do in that case?
They can deploy an algorithm that mathematically decouples those metrics and provides a clear, binary safe or unsafe indicator right at the point of that recurring strain.
Listening to the architecture of these three triggers, high expert load, joint team load, recurring activation patterns, it really reframes how we view human effort.
It truly does.
Because we aren't trying to build systems where the human brain is doing nothing. We want operators engaged. We are actively hunting for the exact moment the biological hardware hits a structural wall, and we're using that coordinate to map the AI.
We are defining the exact borders of human capability and building the technology to begin precisely where biology ends.
Okay, this theoretical framework sounds flawless on paper. It is elegant, it makes logical sense. But theory often falls apart in the mud of the real world. Did the researchers actually test these triggers with operators under intense, chaotic pressure? Or is this all just sterile lab speculation? Because I am deeply skeptical that an AI system introduced into a crisis will just smoothly absorb the workload.
Your skepticism is entirely warranted, and it leads us directly into the empirical study detailed in the academic paper. They did not test this in a sterile lab.
Good.
They conducted a highly rigorous experiment in a simulated operational environment with the Navy, and the results completely shattered the industry's baseline assumptions.
Walk us through the exact setup of this Navy simulation. What were the stakes, and who was in the room?
The researchers utilized 8 active-duty Navy operators. These individuals were placed into the role of Chief of the Watch, which is the central coordination node for managing the ship's engineering plan.
Okay, sounds intense.
Very. They were subjected to a severe, cascading technical emergency in the engine room. Multiple alarms, conflicting data, massive time pressure.
A true high-stakes, maximum stress scenario. So how did they scientifically isolate the impact of the AI in all this chaos?
They employed what is known as a within-subject design.
Break that down for us. Why is a within-subject design important for brain data?
In a within-subject design, every single participant experiences all the conditions of the experiment. If you use a between-subject design, where Group A does it manually and Group B uses the AI, you introduce a massive confounding variable.
Which is?
Baseline neurodiversity. Group B might just naturally have more efficient prefrontal cortices than Group A, which would completely skew the data.
Ah, I see.
By having the exact same operator act as their own control, the researchers isolate the AI as the singular variable affecting blood flow.
So each of the 8 Navy operators ran the catastrophic engine room failure twice. Once entirely manually relying on their own wetware, and once supported by a highly advanced AI system designed specifically for this crisis, which the paper calls the Automatic Advisory Function, or AAF.
Correct. And throughout both scenarios, the operators were monitored using a 15-channel fNIRS sensor configuration placed directly over their prefrontal cortex, with the continuous preprocessing we discussed earlier to filter out all the physical movement of them managing the crisis.
Let's pause and establish the hypothesis here. The standard tech industry assumption, the promise of the AI everywhere era, is that the AAF system is going to digest the crisis data and hand the operator a clean solution.
Right.
Therefore, the fNIRS data should universally show a massive drop in PFC blood flow the moment the AI is turned on. What did the data actually reveal?
The fNIRS data revealed that for a critical subset of the operators, the AI system fundamentally degraded their cognitive state.
Wait, really?
Yes. When the researchers analyzed the data of the inexperienced operators, the novices, the presence of the AI system actually increased their cognitive demands. Their prefrontal activation spiked significantly higher when they were given the AI assistance compared to when they were fighting the emergency entirely on their own.
Hold on, let me push back on that because it totally defies common sense. The AI is doing the math for them. It is offering solutions. How could giving someone the answer key make their brain work harder during an exam?
It comes down to a well-documented cognitive psychology phenomenon known as the dual task penalty, which becomes exponentially worse under stress.
The dual task penalty.
Right. Consider the cognitive reality of a novice chief of the watch. They are already devoting 90% of their prefrontal capacity just to build a mental model of the primary emergency, trying to understand which valves are failing and what the alarms even mean.
Yeah.
Now, You introduce a complex, unfamiliar AI advisor into their visual field.
Oh, so the AI isn't an assistant. To the novice, the AI is just a second, highly demanding job.
Exactly. The novice does not have the neural efficiency or the deep procedural memory to automatically trust the AI. They have to expend massive amounts of their remaining cognitive bandwidth to monitor the AI's interface, interpret its highly technical suggestions, consciously evaluate whether the algorithm is actually correct given the context, and ultimately supervise its actions.
It's like taking a teenager who is just learning to drive, putting them in a blizzard, and then forcing them to use a hyper-complex, multi-layered GPS system.
That is a perfect comparison.
The help actually causes the crash because interpreting the GPS demands the exact same prefrontal attention required to not slide off the road. To the novice brain, the AI is an active cognitive threat.
That analogy is scientifically accurate. The fNIRS data proved objectively that for the novices, the AI was a heavy biological burden. But, and this is the turning point of the entire study, the data showed a radically different physiological response for the highly experienced operators.
The experts in the group.
Yes. For the operators with extensive prior experience, the fNIRS data showed exactly what the engineers originally hoped for. Only the experts showed a significant, measurable reduction in cognitive workload when the automatic advisory function was engaged.
Why the drastic divergence? Why does the expert's brain accept the AI while the novice's brain just rejects it?
Because the experts already possess deeply ingrained, robust mental models of the engine room dynamics. When the AI presented an advisory solution, the expert didn't have to burn prefrontal energy actively calculating if the AI was right.
Because they just knew.
Right, there's deeply held procedural knowledge intuitively aligned with the AI's output. They intrinsically understood the boundaries and logic of the system, allowing them to seamlessly accept the assistance without suffering a dual-task penalty.
They could outsource the cognitive load because they fundamentally trusted the mechanism. This study is an absolute earthquake for system design. It proves empirically that simply throwing an advanced AI at a complex problem can actively endanger operations if you fail to account for the cognitive reality of the specific human using it. You think you're buying safety and efficiency, but for your newer staff, you are literally purchasing a cognitive overload hazard.
It comprehensively shatters the foundational myth that more AI is universally better. And it brings us to the ultimate conclusion of these sources, which outlines a massive economic and structural pivot for the technology sector.
The shift from AI everywhere to AI where needed.
Yes, we are transitioning from the blunt force era of AI everywhere to a highly surgical standard, AI where needed.
This transition relies entirely on the infographic provided in the sources, detailing the neurovalidation layer. Let's dissect this concept. If I am running a massive procurement department for a hospital network or an airline, what exactly is a neurovalidation layer, and why is it about to become mandatory?
The neurovalidation layer is the definitive neuroscience-backed proof that an AI system functions harmoniously with human biology in a specific context. It is the core of what the industry is calling evidence-based AI.
Okay, so it's a requirement.
Yes. If you are engineering a system for mission-critical human-machine teaming, you can no longer walk into a procurement meeting and simply boast that your algorithm has a 99.9% accuracy rate in a vacuum.
Because accuracy doesn't matter if the interface causes the operator's brain to crash.
Exactly. You must provide objective fNIRS-derived data, proving that your algorithm actually reduces cognitive strain for the specific demographic of operators who will use it without triggering a dual-task penalty.
It's the biological receipt. It is the hard proof of purchase that the technology performs exactly as promised for the human nervous system. And the sources point out that this requirement is going to cleave the tech industry into two distinct categories. They contrast the old model of an AI startup with the required future model of a strategic vendor. Unpack the difference between those two entities.
So the traditional AI startup model is purely transactional and capability-focused. They develop proprietary algorithms, they package processing chips, and they sell raw computational capability. They were selling a highly advanced hammer, but they take zero responsibility for whether that hammer shatters the user's thumb.
They hand you the black box and say, good luck integrating this into your control room.
Right. Conversely, a strategic vendor operating in high-stakes domains cannot survive with that model. A strategic vendor doesn't just sell the algorithm, they sell the neurovalidation layer as an operational shield.
What does that look like in practice?
They provide a guarantee, backed by empirical neurodata.
Yeah.
They sit down with the procurement team and say, we have rigorously tested this interface to high-fidelity simulators using fNIRS. We have the data to prove it mitigates expert cognitive saturation under trigger 1 conditions, and we have refined the interface to ensure zero dual task penalty for your junior operators.
That is a staggering competitive advantage. It moves AI from a risky experimental expenditure to a guaranteed operational asset.
Yeah.
But reading through the implications of this, the fNIRS data doesn't just stop at validating software purchases. If we can accurately, objectively map cognitive workload, we can completely redesign the physical and structural environments humans work in.
Oh, the operational implications are revolutionary. Let's look at a highly contentious issue in military and commercial maritime sectors: reduced manning.
Right.
There is constant economic and logistical pressure to put fewer human operators on a ship to save costs and reduce physical risk profiles.
But historically, how do you justify that? How do you prove that 3 people can safely manage a crisis that used to require 5 people? You are basically making an educated guess and praying an engine doesn't catch fire.
Historically, yes, it was a gamble based on intuition and historical precedents. But with the neuroergonomic approach, the guesswork is eliminated.
How so?
You simulate the extreme emergency under the proposed reduced manning structure. You put fNIRS sensors on the 3 operators, push them to the absolute limit, and analyze the biological data.
Okay, I see where this is going.
If their prefrontal cortices remain within safe metabolic operating limits throughout the crisis, you possess scientific, unassailable justification for the reduced staffing. If the data shows they are redlining into cognitive failure, you know definitively that the staffing model is unsafe, regardless of what the financial models say.
It strips the guesswork out of decisions that literally cost human lives. And it scales down to everyday operations, too. You can map out when an air traffic controller structurally requires a break, not based on an arbitrary union clock, but based on the actual measured fatigue of their specific brain on that specific day.
It creates a closed, highly adaptive feedback loop. The continuous biological response of the human operator begins to organically dictate the architecture of the operational environment.
You know, the implication that hits me the hardest regarding all of this, and I really want your perspective on this, is the shift in accountability.
Okay, yeah.
Whenever there is a catastrophic failure in a complex system, a train derailment, a plane crash, a fatal medical dosage error involving a smart pump, the immediate default of the investigating body is almost always human error.
Every time.
The human operator failed to monitor the AI correctly. They lacked situational awareness. But if we accept this neurovalidation framework, it feels like that excuse is completely dead.
Yes.
If a novice operator is given an AI system that was never neurovalidated, and the fNIRS data would have shown that the system causes a dual task penalty, the failure is entirely on the system design, not the human. The system was biologically incompatible with the operator at that exact moment.
It introduces a profound philosophical and legal paradigm shift regarding human error. The Navy study empirically proved that AI can weaponize cognitive overload against a novice.
Weaponize it.
Yeah. If a vendor deploys that AI without a neurovalidation layer, and a novice, already maxed out by an emergency, makes a fatal error because the AI fractured their attention, neuroscience provides a compelling argument that the system engineered the failure.
That is a massive shift.
We can no longer build systems for the perfectly rational, infinite bandwidth brain engineers wish we had. We are now obligated to design for the highly constrained, biologically finite brain we actually possess.
Designing for the brain we have. That encapsulates this entire movement perfectly. The shift toward evidence-based AI fundamentally redefines the contract between human biology and artificial capability. Let's pull all these deeply complex threads together for our listeners.
It's a vast landscape we've covered today if we distill it to its essence.
We began by exposing the critical flaw in the current AI everywhere era. Our reliance on subjective hindsight bias surveys to integrate powerful algorithms into high-stakes environments. We then explored how neuroergonomics provides the solution through fNIRS technology, literally projecting near-infrared light into the prefrontal cortex to objectively, mathematically measure cellular metabolism and executive function saturation in real time.
And utilizing that hard data, we outlined the 3 strategic AI triggers. High expert load, identifying when highly optimized neural pathways fail. Joint team load, using hyperscanning to locate communication bottlenecks. And recurring activation patterns, mapping hidden mental friction. These are the objective biological coordinates signaling exactly where AI is mandated.
We deeply analyzed the Navy experiment, which provided the ultimate cautionary tale. It proved that AI does not universally reduce workload, demonstrating that novices suffer a severe dual-task penalty when forced to manage an emergency while simultaneously supervising unfamiliar AI. And finally, we explored how this data necessitates the neurovalidation layer, forcing vendors to prove their technology is biologically viable for the operator before it is ever deployed.
We are firmly closing the door on the era of intuition and entering the era of neurovalidated, evidence-based AI design.
And for you listening to this, the implications are profound, even if you never set foot in a submarine engine room or an air traffic control tower. Whether you are battling a new complex software suite forced upon you at the office, or you are simply trying to navigate the constant algorithmic interventions on your smartphone, the ultimate metric of success isn't what the technology is technically capable of executing.
No, it isn't.
It is whether your specific finite prefrontal cortex is genuinely benefiting from the interaction, or if the technology is covertly bankrupting your cognitive reserves.
It fundamentally comes down to demanding cognitive respect from the tools we use.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a final, highly provocative extrapolation to consider. We have framed this entire deep dive around high-stakes, multi-million-dollar military and industrial hardware. But the trajectory of technology is always miniaturization and mass consumer adoption. What happens in the very near future when everyday consumer electronics, your noise-canceling headphones, or the augmented reality smart glasses currently hitting the market, inevitably integrate miniaturized fNIRS sensors?
The optical technology required is already shrinking rapidly. A consumer-grade integration is not just plausible, it's highly probable within the next development cycle.
Imagine a smartphone operating system that continuously monitors the hemodynamic response in your prefrontal cortex in real time. Imagine a world where your phone automatically mutes your email notifications, or your semi-autonomous car forcibly takes over the steering wheel simply because the operating system algorithmically determines your cognitive load has crossed a red line. The machine knows you are overwhelmed before you consciously register the stress.
It's an incredible thought.
Will this personalized, omnipresent neurovalidation layer act as the ultimate digital guardian, granting us unprecedented cognitive freedom and safety? Or, by allowing an algorithm to instantly intervene the second our brains experience friction, will we fundamentally surrender our right to mentally struggle, to push past our own limitations, and to organically build the expertise that defines us?
If an AI automatically smooths out every spike in our cognitive load, we have to ask, do we biologically lose the neuroplastic friction required to ever become experts in the first place?
It's a staggering question, but until our headphones are actively reading our hemoglobin levels, we are stuck navigating our own cognitive borders. Which brings us right back to our starting point. The next time you find yourself entirely overwhelmed by the supposedly helpful automated systems in your life, remember the science we discussed today. You aren't crazy. You aren't failing. The diagnostic waters of human stress might be murky, but your biological limits are an undeniable structural reality. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.